The American Adoption Congress 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape number 65.
The capacity that brings me here is I work at a nonprofit research organization called Search Institute. And we do research and evaluation in the areas primarily of dealing with adolescents, children, and families. We like to think of ourselves as an applied research organization. In other words, we like to have our results given to practitioners and clinicians and other people out there in the field who can really use them, find ways to use them. My other capacity as a psychologist is I work in a private clinic. I work as a psychotherapist. And the clinic I work in deals primarily with family systems. So I see the two jobs blending, fairly nicely together. That's a little bit about me. What I want to talk today about, my talk today has about 4 parts. And let me just give you an overview of what you're going to hear. First of all, I want to give you a brief introduction to our study. We're presently, Search Institute is presently conducting a research study on adopted adolescents, and I want to introduce you to that study briefly. Then I want to take you through some of the highlights of the research today. What is it that we do know? Okay, acquaint you with some of that. Then I want to let you know some of our preliminary results. What is it that we found out so far? And then finally, take you through what it is that we still have yet to do. What are the tasks that lie ahead of us? Jim, could you? Let me introduce, before I start, let me introduce one of the members of the audience. His name is Jim Gamboni, and he's the handsome gentleman here in the black sweater. And he is also a staff member at Search Institute and is our Director of Programs and Services. And he has basically come to this adoption conference, to the Congress here, just to learn. His role has been primarily to soak up as much information as he can. But if you have any questions later on or throughout this talk, please let this be informal and interrupt me whenever you please. But Jim will be available afterwards to answer some questions as well. In October of 1989, Search Institute received a $1 million grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to conduct a research study on adopted adolescents, which we call the Service and Mental Health Needs of Adopted Adolescents. The study is the first of its kind in that it's national in scope and will comprise in the end well over 2,000 adopted adolescents and their families. Let me give you a brief history of the funding. You certainly, if you've been around here long enough, but even after Kate's talk this morning, would get the idea that adoption work is difficult and requires perseverance. And I'm here to tell you that that's true even in the area of research. And some of the folks in the audience, I'm looking at 2 of them who are researchers, Rini and Paul, hugging each other in the second row. Not too much, but but they could tell you, I'm sure, similar stories about what it's like to do research in adoption. Our study, unfortunately, began as the result of a tragedy. There was an adoptive family in Minneapolis who lost their adoptive son, a 17-year-old, to suicide. The family he was home from college on the weekend, and the family was getting ready to go to church. And they called for him to come and went down. He didn't respond, and they went downstairs and found that he had shot himself in the basement. And the family, not knowing what to do, talked with some of their friends and asked, the question that adoptive parents often ask, which is what good could possibly come out of this tragedy? And in talking with various folks, they decided to donate their memorial monies to Search Institute to develop a proposal to conduct a study on adopted adolescents so that tragedies like this could be prevented down the line. We subsequently did do that proposal. This was about 6, 7, 8 years ago now, and took it to the federal government. The federal government said, this is a wonderful study, it needs to be done, but it can't be done. You won't be able to find adoptive families. You won't be able to find a random sample of adoptive families, and even if you do, they don't want to be studied. And so we then conducted a feasibility study in which we invited agencies nationwide to help us locate adoptive families randomly, and then ask their participation through what we called an open-ended questionnaire. We received something like a 70% response rate from the adoptive parents and over a 40% response rate from the adopted adolescents. And those of you that know research in adoption or research in any other area, those are good rates to receive, especially from the kids. So we felt very encouraged, took it back to the federal government, and after, I don't know, 2 or 3 gyrations going back and forth, we finally did receive the funding, for which we are about which we are very excited. Let me say also one thing, and that's the way that Search Institute conducts studies, I think, is very unique in that we like to think of ourselves as experts in research, but not necessarily experts in the area that we're researching. So from the very beginning, we have adopted a collaborative stance with professionals and adoptive parents, all members of the triad, birth parents and adoptees, to ask them and ask the professionals out there that work very well in adoption to help us with the study. So it's been a collaborative effort, and I hope I am able to point that out as the ways in which that collaboration has occurred as I proceed through my talk. Anyway, here are some of the questions that we hope to answer. In other words, these are the purposes of our study. First of all, we want to answer the question, do adopted adolescents have mental health problems that differ from those of non-adopted adolescents? We hear many, many times that adopted adolescents show up in greater proportions than the general population warrants, than their proportion in the general population, in mental health clinics, in school situations, in juvenile court systems, in all problem situations. We want to know if that is indeed the case in the general population. The second question is, if that is the case, if so, in what specific areas are adopted adolescents more at risk? In other words, if they have problems, what are those problems? Thirdly, to what extent are these risks influenced by family and adoption-related dynamics? If we know what the problems are, we'd like to make some predictive statements about where the problems may be arising from, or what might some of the causes be. And then finally, how can the mental health needs of adopted adolescents and their families best be served? In other words, this study is of no good, and those of you that went to Paul Sachde's presentation this morning would hear his strong statement that a study is no good if it sits there on a shelf. It's only useful if it gets out there to the people that need the results, which are members of the triad, legislators, mental health workers, social service agencies. They are the ones that need the results. So those are the 4 questions that we hope to answer. Let me now talk briefly about some of the highlights of the research to date. And these are the themes that I'd like to go through. I'd like to just talk somewhat generally about the quality of the research that exists so far, then highlight some things on the genetic versus environmental issues, talk about psychological and social adjustment of adoptees, and this third point is the point at which our study is most heavily focused. And then finally, the little that we know, which is not much, but some of the characteristics of adoptive parents. Okay. Whoops, let me go back. Let me stay briefly with the quality of the research before I go into some of the other results. Some of the problems that exist in the research to date are, first of all, the adequacies of samples that exist in the research studies. In looking at the literature, we did a literature search of all the studies in the last 20 plus years, starting from 1965 on. Only a handful of those are studies that have random samples. And Paul's is again, one of the most recent ones that involves a random sample. But many of the studies that have looked at adopted adolescents are taking groups of adolescents that come to mental health facilities, and saying, okay, of this population, of this, what we would call a clinical population, this proportion of adopted adolescents are having these kinds of problems, et cetera. But there are very few studies that exist, that have random samples. Our study is a random sample, and I'll talk more about that later. Also, the majority well over 60% have samples that are less than 100. So the numbers are small. And so conclusions have been made based on small numbers, and that is a significant problem in the research so far. The second problem is the lack of a control group. Not often will you see adopted adolescents compared to so-and-so or such and such or thus and thus. There's just been statements made about adopted adolescents. And whenever I'm in the audience in a presentation on research, everybody asks the question, well, compared to what? You know, they have to have some baseline statements from which to compare statements about adoptees or adoptive parents or birth parents. So that's another significant problem. And then the third problem, again, which we hope to address, is the lack of survey instruments. There are very few ways of measuring adoption-related dynamics. They just don't exist. There have been some questionnaires that have been developed formally and informally, and they tend not to hold up strongly when criteria of reliability, validity, norming, etc. are held up. So that's another thing that is a problem in the research so far. Okay, now let me move on. Let me talk briefly about the genetic environmental issues. Our study is not concentrated on the genetic environmental issues. And so, again, we're more interested in the psychological, social aspects. But we do recognize the importance of genetic issues, and we do realize that we have to know, something about that. There are some areas in which geneticists, behavioral geneticists, say that genetics is a larger component probably than environment. And some of those areas are intelligence, alcoholism, schizophrenia, depression, and even such areas as criminality and suicide. These are areas in which it's been hypothesized that the genetic component may be larger than the environmental. Now, conclusions regarding these have come largely from twin studies. For example, I'm all set, Tony, thank you. For example, there was the audiovisual person, and we were just kind of scrambling to get this put together. Some of the studies have been Tom Bouchard's at the University of Minnesota. Those are probably the most famous, but they generally come from adoption, and probably being from Holland, Rena, you would know some of the famous studies that come out of the Scandinavian countries that deal with the genetic environmental issues. Generally, the conclusion from these studies is the following, that even when something has a large genetic component, that does not mean that the environmental component is nil. What that does mean is that a person has a genetic predisposition to a certain trait which may or may not be triggered or exacerbated by the environment. And that, I think, is the most important thing to remember. One of the best examples of this is alcoholism, in which we know quite well that children of alcoholics are more likely to be at risk for alcoholism than children of non-alcoholics. That does not mean that if a person has one or two parents that are alcoholic, that he or she will necessarily be a problem drinker or an alcoholic. It just means that he or she is at risk for that, more so than someone who doesn't have alcoholic parents. Another good example is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has a large genetic component in that two things have to happen. One is there has to be schizophrenia in the family, but there also has to be a prenatal or a perinatal trauma. If that occurs, then a neurological lesion in the brain happens, and then there's almost very little that can be done. But without that environmental prenatal or perinatal trauma, the person may not develop characteristics of schizophrenia later in life. So those are the important things, that even when something has a large genetic component, it doesn't mean that it's going to show up necessarily. Of greater interest to us in our study is the issue of personality. And this is where I'd like to have it illustrated by this quote. The evidence for substantial heritability of personality traits is weaker than one might have expected. So, in the area of personality, which many people think has a large genetic component, this is less so than we may have expected. And that means that personality characteristics, or the expression of them, is largely malleable. That means it can be shaped, okay? And it's not entirely shaped by genetics. That means that we can work with it. So personality is an area that can be significantly shaped by the environment. And again, personality is something that our study is focusing more greatly on. We're interested in psychological and social variables. This brings me, again, to the psychological and social aspects of adoption. Please, again, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to interrupt. Hi.
The issue that you just talked about, a prenatal trauma which might be related to schizophrenia,
Mm-hmm.
relinquishment or separation at birth be considered such a trauma?
Did everybody hear her question? Okay, her question was, for those of you listening on the tape, would prenatal or perinatal trauma, could that be something such as relinquishment of a child? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know when they say a pre or perinatal trauma, I would have to ask a behavioral geneticist what he or she means by that. Is there anyone in the audience that might know? I guess when I thought pre or perinatal trauma, I was not thinking of relinquishment of a child. That is not what comes to my mind, and I would doubt that that would be a positive trauma. I'm thinking more of a physical trauma to the child, but I would have to check that out. But that's my gut response. Someone was back there nodding their head. Go ahead.
Something like oxygen deprivation,
Yeah,
or something like
right. I'm thinking more in terms of oxygen deprivation.
brain.
Exactly. Something that would directly physiologically impact the child, less so than emotionally, which is what we talk about with the in utero bonding of a mother to child. Somebody back here?
Yeah, this doesn't relate to that issue, but are you going to investigate more questions than the ones you proposed? Or were those like the overall general?
Those are the overall general questions, and underneath those come at least, I would say at least 50 other questions, such as how should parents deal with openness? You know, all those kinds of things come under those questions. But yeah, those are the 4 kind of umbrella questions we're hoping to answer.
Which other psychological aspects are you going to be examining when you adopted adolescents?
Which other psychological aspects will we be examining? Oh, a host of other things. What do they think about their birth parents? Do they think about their birth parents? How do they feel? Do they feel treated differently by teachers, peers? Do they feel different? Transracial minority issues?
I know a lot of the past research has been done on self-esteem.
Mm-hmm. We'll be looking at self-esteem too.
Which aspects of self-esteem?
Well, self-esteem is such a broad category that we tend to look at it much more narrowly defined. So we'll be looking at self-esteem in a broad category, but then indicators of self-esteem, like does a child feel good about him or herself in this setting versus another setting, like in school? Do they feel like they belong in their family? Do they feel like they belong in school? Self-esteem is so broad, it's gotten to be kind of a catch-all.
Well, I was thinking more in mind of like global and role-specific self-esteem skills.
Global and more specific self-esteem skills?
Role-specific.
Role specific. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that? Because I've not heard that term before.
Role-specific self-esteem could be defined as how one sees himself within family or within the roles of society.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
The global self-esteem is more or less the
How they feel just generally about themselves.
yeah, and it's more of a risk-taking
Mm-hmm.
evaluation.
Okay. Thank you for that distinction. Someone over here had a question. Did you have a question?
I was only thinking that the unborn, when that one comes in a relinquishment situation,
Mm-hmm.
the woman might have had a lot of stress
The woman in a relinquishing situation
during the pregnancy.
might have had low stress?
A lot of stress.
A lot of stress. Okay.
And during the pregnancy. And
Right.
It might have influenced the child.
Yes.
We think it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, as soon as you know that the child is relinquished, you know that there are quite a few risks.
Mm-hmm.
And also of alcoholism, smoking, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps there is a little bit more risk when the child is relinquished than I don't need to calculate.
I would suspect so. I would suspect there is more risk. I mean, I don't think there's any hard data other than maybe what comes out of your study, Paul, you know, to be seen yet. But I would be so surprised if it wasn't the case.
That depends on the cultural situation in which the
Very
child
much
is
so.
relinquished.
Mm-hmm.
That you have
Right, right. He was saying that it depends, the trauma of relinquishment depends very much on the cultural situation in which the child was relinquished, and that is very true.
And second, the age in which a child is relinquished.
Mhm.
What I have seen in my research and in our clinical practice is that when the age is just a little bit over 12 months, then you see a decrease in,
An increase.
increase in problems
Right.
at the stage of adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't talk about schizophrenia,
Right, but just general adjustment factors.
behavioral problems.
Mm-hmm. And that is true. I think the research definitely shows that the older a child is at time of placement.
The older is not correct. So that means that you have a straight line.
Okay.
I don't say that you are saying that, but it sounds like it.
Mm-hmm.
Not the older. When a child understands a little bit more about what it is to be relinquished.
To be relinquished.
And then the child can communicate with you.
Right.
About adoption and you will go to another family or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a child of 5 or 6 years of age. That's
Mhm.
a different case.
Then it's a different case.
I don't say that there is no trauma.
Mhm.
But it's a different trauma from a child of 12 months
Or less than.
till 36 or
Mhm.
40 months.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to divide the age group.
So you're saying it's not a linear relationship,
Oh,
but
definitely
different
not.
things happen.
Definitely not.
Different things happen at that time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Will you attempt to obtain the prenatal records and birth records for these adopted children to go along or so that you can establish, for instance, with the APGAR index, whether there was any physiological birth trauma, as well as if you wish to include, if you consider including the circumstances surrounding relinquishment.
We
And
w-
perhaps contacting the birth parent to find out what type of pregnancy circumstances she experienced.
We will be looking at adoptees, adopted adolescents, and looking at the agent. I'll get into this a little bit later in terms of how our sample will actually be conducted. The sample will be done. I'll say one or two statements about it right now. Agencies will be contacting their families because we don't have access to agency records to get a random sample. And agencies, we hope, will give us as much non-identifying information as possible about the adolescents that we have. So
That could be totally inadequate and inaccurate.
it's probably going to be inadequate and inaccurate. Yes, you're absolutely right. And
I suggest you ask them to contact the birth mothers. They don't have to identify each other, but why not?
we've talked about that, and and people have. I think the one criticism that, or one question that we've gotten more often than not is, what is the effect of the birth parents, and can you somehow incorporate birth parents into this study? And what we've done is said we're more interested in how the adolescent is viewing the birth parents and what the adolescent's perspective is on the birth parents. And we're going to maybe in our next study or whatever do as much as we can to actually build birth parents in, or Paul's study is building birth parents in right from the beginning on his. So we're going to kind of have to play piggyback on each other's research projects and build information that way. And ours, I think, is limited in that aspect.
I think
So
you'll find birth mothers willing to participate.
I would suspect that most of them would be. What might be the problem, and I hesitate to say this very strongly, is that to get an adolescent to participate, you have to get their parents' consent. Okay, and so we have to get the adoptive parents' consent to study the adolescents. And in that situation, the adoptive parents, who would then contact the birth parents? I mean, it's not the agency that's being studied. The agency is the medium to studying the adoptive adolescent.
Just that the agency contact the birth parents.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very difficult.
Difficult, but it's scientifically more accurate if you do it that way.
Yeah. But
It gives more information, agreed. It definitely gives more information.
So let's not have another flawed study because you want to exclude birth parents from your study.
The study can only do so much. I mean,
We're attacking adolescents. That's a broad topic, all right.
Just in response to your question, ideally, yes, it's a very, you have to, in research, you have to make sure that what is ideal and what's feasible. Surely that there is a difference between them. If you narrow that difference, the better research it is. But in this case, now look at the implication. The agency, first of all, agency has to agree to that. All right, granted, agency will cooperate. But then agency has to, now this is something about 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
12 to 18 years ago.
Okay.
Our adolescents are 12 to
years
18 now.
ago that the agency has to locate those birth parents. Mind you, this is a random sample. You said that. So you pick the one, and this person lives 20 years ago, 15 years ago, lived in Minneapolis, or had moved out of that place. So look at the cost. Look at how to locate those persons. Look at the tracking down, and then to contact that person, to call. The person may have married, the names have changed, the address have changed, remarried. I mean, look at the enormity of that to contract.
We do that all
create
the
that.
time, right?
Well, you know,
And if you,
this movement might help you with that.
I'm sorry,
The movement might
but then
help.
you are
Mhm.
destroying the randomness.
Yeah.
That's
You
what
only
happens.
have to work for a year, but then don't talk about random sample.
And that is what happens.
Your random sample comes from the agency.
Yeah,
Well-
whereas the person you have, they have random sample comes from the agency has identified 20 people are randomly, and those 20 people they must go and contact, locate those 20 people,
That's
right?
right.
And those 20 people, how are you going to contact those? So by the time you contact, you may end up with 5 people. So where's your randomness?
So
And
again,
the cost.
yeah, you offset one gain by
Yeah.
gaining another.
So I think it's the way they have designed it, it's much more approaching feasibility aspect than the idealistic one.
Well,
It's-
you can,
I'll get to you.
you can locate the adopted family. You can also locate the birth.
No. That's
Not
not so easy.
feasible, not easy.
Definitely not
The
so easy.
information that actually myself admitted that the information about birth father was
Pardon?
very
The agency would have to
we
do
have
it.
the same
Agency
problem
has to do it.
in finding out random sample of the birth parent, birth mothers. It took an enormous amount of energy and time and a lot of case loss. But because of we were covering a small area, one province, therefore it was feasible over a 3-year period. But they are doing a national study, and I think it would take years.
It would take a long time.
Yeah.
How long will yours
And by the time they
I'll get back to this. I don't want to argue that your point isn't valid because it certainly is. It's just a matter of how much can you do at one point in time. One person back there had a comment. I want to make sure I get her, and then we'll move on.
Aren't you losing your random sample by having the adopted parents consent to their adopted adolescent participating? Because it then becomes a self-selected, or adopted parent selected sample.
Her question is, are you losing the randomness of the sample by having to have the adoptive parents' consent? That's the law. There's no way around that fact. You cannot study an adolescent without a parent's consent. So that
I
one,
understand that, but at that point, it loses its randomness. It becomes self-selected.
yes, yes.
That's a human subject.
That's a response bias. You can select a random sample, and then at that point you have to say X% did not participate, and so we can only generalize our results to the percent that did. Absolutely true.
Have a non-response.
And you can have a non-response. People that may just not respond because they're not interested.
No. You can check the non-response. You have you know some facts about the non-respondents, so
Yes.
you can check it.
Right.
Not just that you have.
That you know nothing about them.
No.
Yes.
You can compare the groups, the non-respondents.
Mm-hmm. Right. 2 comments over here, and then I'm going to...
Have you
Keep going.
established your design already?
Yes, we have.
So our comments about how you might modify it are really kind of peripheral?
Are they peripheral? In something major, like could we include birth parents at this point, I think that's something that we discussed way up front and talked about and said that's probably not going to work for us right now. In other ways, and I'm going to talk about that, your comments are going to be most invited and most pertinent.
Are you, okay, then I'll ask mine, and that is, are you going to be checking attitudes of adoptive parents?
Yes.
Okay.
We are going to be surveying the adoptive parents as well. If we have to get their consent, it's a good time to study them too.
I'm wondering the kind of input that you're getting from adoptees who are working with you. The concern I have as an adoptee,
Mhm.
this is a very major study.
Mhm.
It could have a significant impact on how
You're perceived.
our society perceives adoptees. It's certainly going to be used as
Mhm.
funded. And the lack of randomness. I understand your research limitations and the problems you've got with that, but you do have a biased sample. I can't conceive of too many adoptee families where there's grand dysfunction in the family where the parents are going to willingly say, oh sure, survey our child. The other problem is that so many adoptees are in denial that they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear rather than what is really on their mind, and it's a lifestyle. So I go back to my original question. What are your adoptees telling you, the ones you're working with, regarding the same issues?
I think this question depends on the number of measurements and how big the measurements are.
Bullshit.
Well, I think
That's just what I said.
Well, let me.
A lot of adoptees in denial, and that's a problem in talking to them.
Well, I'm going to show you some of the results that we've gotten so far, and that may be a time to address your comment more when I tell you what some of the adoptees have told us. Okay. Okay. Anyway, psychological and social aspects of adoptees. Whoops, I went the wrong way. This is a study by Brzezinski, which was a random sample of 260 children done in 1984, and he has recently written a book about that, which is under my slide projector at the moment, along with your book, Paul. But anyway, he talks about adopted children being more vulnerable than other children to emotional, behavioral, and educational problems. Now, Brzezinski's study was quite exemplary in that he did not use a clinical sample. He was one of the folks that used a random sample. And he obtained 260 children, half of whom were adopted and half of whom were not. And though it was not, wait a minute, I said it was a random sample. It wasn't. It was a non-clinical sample because he obtained them by advertisements. So it was a volunteer sample, though non-clinical. The most important conclusion that he drew was this one. Although he noted, and again, you have to be careful in how you interpret your results, that even on his measures, though adopted children showed up performing less well on the measures that he used, they nonetheless performed in the normal range. So he talked about the notion of vulnerability and said that they may not be maladjusted necessarily, but they may be more vulnerable. And I think this is something at Search Institute that we translate into the concept of at-riskness. You know, and we talk about, is a population more at risk than another group? Is this group more at risk than another group? And again, that's sort of the parallel to the genetic environmental issue, in which you can talk about a genetic predisposition which may or may not be triggered by the environment. And so it may be the case that adopted persons are more at risk for certain things, and psychological and social variables like how the family deals with the dynamics of the adoption may or may not trigger certain vulnerabilities in that person. Yes?
I understand that his sample did not differentiate between infant adoptions and later adoptions. Is yours doing so?
Ours does so. We are looking only at infant adoptions, so that we will be looking at only infant adoptions, and I'm trying to remember exactly what his did.
I haven't read it, but I've heard that it lumped them together.
He's done several of them, and so I'm cautious to say which one this one was quoting from. I read it just yesterday, but that fact is escaping me again. Okay. An area of particular vulnerability for adolescents is identity. And this quote, I think, says, though identity problems may reach a crisis stage for any adolescent, These problems appear to be particularly severe for the adopted individual who's preoccupied with the fact that he or she is adopted. His or her search for identity is complicated by the fact that he or she has two sets of parents. And again, one second. Identity is a major task of adolescence. Okay, that is the time in which kids are expected to form their own identity separate from their parents. And the second task is precisely that, separation. They're supposed to be separating from their parents. But for an adopted person, that gets very complicated. Which set of parents are they separating from? The adoptive parents, the birth parents, or both? You had a question?
Are you done?
Yes, I'm done with this piece.
Do you think your sample or your study will improve upon their unsignificant results in their study?
In which one? Brodzinski's?
No, the one you're presenting here, Merkel and Guys.
Oh, because they said that there were not significant results in this one.
Yes.
I think so, because I think that, well, I don't know. I think that whatever results we get, again, because theirs was a smaller sample, our sample will be roughly 2,000. So I think if we make statements about their feelings or process of identity, it'll be based on a much larger number.
Are you using similar measurements in their study? They used Rosenberg's self-esteem.
We're not using that. We have some we have our own indicators of self-esteem that we think are probably quite a bit better. And that's why I was interested to hear your comments about self-esteem. So I'll talk about that in a bit too. You seem to be well-versed in self-esteem issues. A little, okay. Okay, I was talking about separation of parents, and then I thought, speaking of parents, what we do know about them is that couples who acknowledge their child's origins had significantly higher relationship scores, and that means within the couple, with each other, than couples who rejected this knowledge. So a few studies have talked precisely about marital relationships within an adoptive family, and it seems that those who deal more openly with the child's adoptive status have better relationships. And again, very few firm conclusions have been drawn in this area as well.
You know, of course, the study from David Kirk and Dr. Finch, it says exactly the same.
Say that again? I didn't hear you.
Kirk's study of adoptive kinship, you know, of course, that it says exactly the same.
He says exactly the same thing, yeah. Kirk's studies of adoptive kinship.
Very, very large numbers of adoptive parents.
Mm-hmm. And that's true. He says exactly the same thing.
And he says a little bit more than only, no, okay. No, you read it and you'll see yourself.
Okay. I have read it, but it's been a couple years. I think I read it 2 years ago. Okay, let me now go back to our study and talk about some of the preliminary results and the themes that the gentleman was asking back there about what have the adopted people been saying so far. First of all, our project will go through 3 phases. The first phase is the development of the survey instruments. And again, there are no instruments out there right now which have strong figures in terms of reliability, validity, and norms that deal specifically with adoption. So phase 1 of our study is precisely to develop those instruments. And again, because we're not experts in adoption, we invited Triad members to help sensitize us to the issues that we needed to be studying. And we asked them to do that via what we called an open-ended questionnaire. This was sent out nationally to many people. Probably when we had a press conference in July of, I think, a year ago, and asked for help in terms of Triad members again, acquainting us with what it is that we needed to know. And we got over 600 phone calls and responses back, and probably 500 of those people actually sent in questionnaires. The purpose of this questionnaire was, again, to help us become familiar with the kinds of issues that we needed to include in our survey instruments. And these are some of the things that the Triad members told us. These are the themes that emerged from the adoptees. And they ranged in age from 10 to 60. And again, this was a volunteer sample. Just anybody who wanted to help us, we encouraged to do that. And the themes were feeling lucky or grateful, feeling different, lack of information on one's background, and birth parents. And I'll talk about each of these in detail. Yeah.
Questions was the survey.
How many questions was this particular one? This was a 2-page questionnaire, in which we had several categories, and it varied for each of the triad members. But it had, I think the youth one, or the adopted person one, had 19 questions, and the parent one had maybe 20, something like that.
What was the number of responses for the adopted?
We got over 200 responses from the adopted folks, and 100 of them were kids under the age of 18, and 100 were adult adoptees. So they were about half and half.
Is there any validation that they were who they said they were?
No, this was all volunteer, so there were no checks on this, because this part is not a controlled part. This is just anybody that has anything to tell us about adoption, we're welcoming it.
What was the pilot study?
It's a pilot study of sorts. It's an exploratory analysis. It's just, help us, kind of a plea.
Inform you.
To inform us.
So that's good.
Yes.
Very good.
Pretty right on too.
The themes.
I was gonna say, being an adoptee, yeah, that's
Those are the themes that
Yeah, it's
probably in that order too.
probably in that order. Well,
That's what I feel.
the interesting one was the feeling lucky or grateful. I shouldn't say the interesting one. They were all interesting. It showed up in quotes like this. This is a 17-year-old Caucasian male. I'm pleased that I am where I am. My family's a good one. We do have our problems, but it's usually worked out. And in this respect, most of the time we had kids saying, and adult adoptees saying, I'm grateful. I'm glad that I have these opportunities. I'm glad that I have a home and a family. And the other interesting, and many transracial and international adoptees were talking about the fact that they were glad that they lived in the United States as opposed to a third world country. But one thing that I thought was especially interesting was the number of people that said, I'm glad I'm alive. And again, as a clinician, I thought the only other group that I have ever heard talk about that they're glad to be alive are people that have had near-death experiences. And I thought to myself, adoptees have had near-death experiences because abortion was possibly an option, in determining their life status. So psychodynamically, that was a very interesting theme to me, this business about feeling glad to just plain be alive. The other theme, a lack of information about one's background, showed up predominantly for the adolescents in saying, I wish my parents were more open about my adoption and information about my birth parents. They also, the adolescents and the adult adoptees, not surprisingly, talked about the fact that they wanted the system to change. Many kids under the age of 18 said, it really makes me mad that I have to be 18 to search. And they did not like that, and they felt out of control of their own lives, even at quite young ages, even at the ages of adolescence. And the adult adoptees, with regard to lack of information, were obviously more angry at the system than they were about their parents' role in that. The other theme, this was the perpetual question that showed up with regard to their birth parents. I wonder why my birth mom gave me up for adoption. I know that it's impossible to ever find this out, but I just will go on wondering and wondering until the day I die. And this showed up, the Caucasians probably had more of a theme of saying, I'm going to find out. The international and transracial adoptees were less sure of their ability to ever find out. So for them, it remained more a large capital question mark than it did for people who were adopted and whose birth parents were likely to still have been in this country. And then finally, from a Korean 15, she said, I wish that I was taller, but it's no big deal. And, I chuckled when I read this. I thought that's really sweet. But then I thought of my own background, because I'm Indian, and East Indian, born in India. And I thought, in a way, she's saying I feel different, and she's saying, and she's minimizing that difference, as adolescents are wont to do. And because as a Korean, she's probably shorter than most of her white friends. And this is her way of saying, I feel different. So the feelings of being different showed up in many, many arenas, and physical appearance was just one of them. From the adoptive parents, these were the themes that emerged. And interestingly, two of them very much paralleled the adoptees' experience. And that was lack of information on the child's background and birth parents. They seemed to wonder and think as much about birth parents as the adoptees did. But the other two that they wanted help with was parenting help and information and public awareness and education. These were the two themes that were most predominant for the adoptive parents. And they showed up in statements like this. I'm most puzzled by bad behavior and if it has anything to do with their feelings about being adopted or if it's just ordinary bad behavior. The biggest question on parenting help is what's normal and what's adopted. There's very little at this time ability to distinguish, and adoptive parents are hypersensitive to parenting anyway, so they're very, very sensitive to when is it okay and when is it not, when's it something I really have to deal with and when should I ignore it. But this was the area of parenting help they wanted the most information on. It bothers me that I have very little information to give my children, and these were their concerns. They also had significant concerns about lack of information. So again, legislators that feel that adoptive parents are the group that are blocking, things like open records or access to records, perhaps that is not the case. At least from the responses that we've seen so far, adoptive parents very much want to know their child's medical information, et cetera, et cetera. They feel as much in the dark as the adoptee does.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
One day the birth parents will want to meet their biological child, and they do think a lot about the birth parents. And this is one of a range of feelings that were expressed on our open-ended questionnaire. There were many statements about, I wish I could assure the birth parents that their child is doing okay. I wish I could make a statement to that effect. I wish I could, this wasn't so much I wish I could, this was more of a, I feel grateful that the adoptive parents relinquished this child, and in the sense that I am now able to experience having children. I'm sorry that they had to lose a child, and yet I feel very grateful. So there was a lot of guilt, wrapped up in there. There was a lot of feelings of, oh gosh, did someone have to give up a child for me to have one? There were a lot of feelings of anger toward birth parents. No question about that as well. Some of them, this was not an angry statement, by the way. This was just sort of a feeling of insecurity. As much as adoptees perhaps fear abandonment, adopted parents fear loss, that someday someone's going to come and take their child away. They never have that sense of security, at least in the questionnaires that we received. So that theme keeps coming up over and over again. But many times there was anger expressed toward the birth parents. That came up most often when there were explicit issues of abuse related to the child's past history. There were many parents that said, I am really angry that the birth parents abused this child, in cases in which they knew that had happened. That was where the anger came out the most strongly. And again, that would make sense as to why that was so. And then this adoptive mom kind of summed it up. She says, I'm happy that my children are healthy, intelligent, and basically good people. I'm happy we are people who have found the strength to cope. I'm happy we've been able to keep a relationship, though rough at times. I'm happy we have good insurance coverage. I thought, boy, she said it all. She's happy about a lot of things. Yes?
Excuse me, did you say that most of the children, most of your population are infants?
Our sample that will be collected later, and I'll talk about our actual study, will all be adoptees who were adopted as infants, yes.
But these now that you're talking about?
These now are, we have completely, they're a range. We have the knowledge, but this as Renee called it, I keep saying your name 3 different ways.
Say Renee.
Is it Renee?
Oh, please do.
Okay.
And that's for my mother, so.
I've said it 3 different times since I've been up here, and different each time. It's Renee?
Born again.
Means born again.
Renaissance.
From Renaissance. That's lovely. Now, what was I saying about what you said?
This was just
Yeah. As he was saying, he called it a pilot study, but in this study, we just asked the wide range of people to respond. So everyone responded. Yes?
We understand your real study then will not include hardly any international adoptions because hardly any of those happen really at birth. Most of the Korean adoptions have been 4 months on up.
Well, infant adoptions we're defining as somewhere between 15 to 18 months. So we have explicitly drawn a cutoff.
Okay, well you said I thought you said at birth earlier.
I hope I didn't. I may have. What I meant was infant adoptions, which we're defining. We asked agency people what would they say should be a cutoff for that, and how could we include a substantial proportion of transracial and international adoptees. And they said do it somewhere between 15 and 18 months was the recommended.
Second question, will your sample only include where
I'll talk more about that later, but it will include both. It will include families in which, because that's going to be part of the control group thing, but it'll do both.
Will there be differentiation between infant as in week, 2 week, 3 week old and the older child? Will it be scaled by age?
Do you mean, will we be looking at,
The results that you publish.
will we divide them up in terms of age of adoption within infant?
Yes.
So that we should differentiate between someone who was adopted at 18 months versus someone who was adopted at 1 week?
Yes.
Yes, we will.
You will be doing that.
Yes, we will be doing that.
Using age as a control variable.
Yes. And again, with over 2,000 folks, we'll be able to make whenever we draw a subgroup, we'll still be able to have a fairly large sample to make reasonable conclusions about that. But yes, that'll be very important. Yes, you had oh, you were just stretching.
3 subgroups, up to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months.
12 to 18 months. So the recommendation is
Child development.
up to 6 months, 6 to 12 months. Right. Those are the stages of child development that follow child psychology.
It's okay.
Yep.
If your first subgroup is up to 6 months,
Mhm.
I suggest there will be a whole lot of people that will just throw out your data because they'll say, oh, it doesn't apply to us. We got our child at birth.
No, it means
I would like a much smaller first step than 6 months.
First, you know, first 3 months or first month, next month, you know, maybe, you know, birth, first month, and then third month, and then, you know, month.
there are many ways that you could draw those lines. I mean, what Renee is suggesting is that child psychology says that X amount of growth and X amount of mental maturity happens between 0 and 6 months, and then 6 to 12, and then 12 to 18. But we can draw it finer.
When you speak to the issue of appliedness,
Mhm.
part of the purpose is to influence adoptive parents,
Mhm.
adoption systems.
Mhm.
I would sure recommend that you consider how people are going to want to discount it, whatever the results are.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Set up
I'm sorry.
Some protections against someone being able to say
Of
this
course.
doesn't apply.
Of course.
Because my child is.
Of course. I thought you were talking about something completely different. I thought you were saying that people won't respond if
No.
they say right away. You're saying they're going to say, if your results apply to a 6-month infant, but ours was adopted at 1 week.
Right.
I understand what you're saying now. Okay. Got it.
Also, in addition to that, I agree with Renee's different developmental models, but
Mhm.
also take in consideration that a newborn placed in the adoptive home is going to bond differently than an older infant that was placed in a foster
home.
first.
Yep.
And was able to bond possibly with foster parents, and then removed from that environment and then placed with the adoptive family.
Absolutely. Which could happen 0 to 1 month or 1 week or 3 weeks or whatever.
So
Exactly.
number of placements will be a-
Right.
Yep. Number of placements is very important. I'm sorry, he had a question, then I'll come back to you.
Just wonder, could you get around that self-selection problem and randomness by selecting families that had kids that are over 18 where they wouldn't need parental permission, and they've been pretty much already gone through their teen years. You may be picking up families then that are 14, 15, 16 years old that have a number of years to go of experience that you can get around the self-selection by picking early, very young adults that were of the majority age.
And that would certainly be a study. It would be a different study because we're wanting to look at adolescence in process. You know, what are kids like when they're adolescents? And again, many people have said, but you know, you're studying adolescence. Well, they only know what's going on retrospectively. It's only when an adopted person is 20 years old or 25 or 30 that they really know what the adoption issues are. And you know, you need to look at them too. And I say, absolutely, that's true.
Make the study longitudinal. Okay, that's your advice.
We could make the study longitudinal. Absolutely. The Colorado Adoption Project, which perhaps you've heard of, is a longitudinal study of adopted. And they're looking at infants, and they're now in their 15th year. They've been studying 300 adoptees from infant to now 15. And I assume that if they keep getting funding, they're going to go into the adult years. It's a wonderful study, but it would be a different study. You had a question, but looks like
You've answered that.
I've answered it. Okay. Let me go on to the themes from the birth parents. They were exemplified by the following statements. The first one was, I'm happy that she, the child, was able to give her love to her adopted parents, and that they were able to have a child, as I was too young and immature to give her the kind of life I wished I could. More often than not, the birth mothers are saying, I couldn't do it, I'm glad somebody could. And they are most often expressing feelings of love for the child in some way, shape, or form, and hoping that the child has been taken care of in some fashion. And the other theme that comes from the birth parents is, I become emotional about the date of her birth, Christmas, and that she might hate me. And this, I think, supports Paul's Sachdeva studies on birth parents, which is that the feelings don't go away, that adoption is not a point in time. You know, it's a process that lingers and goes on and on and on for all three members of the triad, and that we need to be very sensitive to that issue. So everything like an anniversary, you know, means a reliving of the process, means going through it again. And so those were some of the comments that the birth mothers talked to us about. Now, we took the information from these questionnaires, and let me now kind of talk to you about exactly this is sort of what we found, and now let me talk to you about what needs to happen in our study a little bit more. Whoops. I have one no, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. I was just jumping ahead of myself. Remember the slide that I had that had development of the survey instruments highlighted? That's what this process has all been about. And what we did was take the information from these questionnaires, as well as all the talking that we've been doing to people over the past year and a half, and we've been consolidating it into two survey instruments, one for adopted adolescents and one for adoptive parents. Each of these instruments contains roughly what we would call maybe 13 or 15 adoption dynamics. They vary depending on which instrument you're talking about. And we've invited so far somewhere between 30 to 40 to 50 experts to just kind of give us their opinion on how the surveys look. The next thing, and also to get their feedback. We've also had face-to-face meetings with about 20 adoptive parents and youth to get their reactions to the instruments. And we're in the process of incorporating all of these persons' comments into draft 2 of our survey instrument, which we would like then to field test on roughly about 300 adoptive parents and adopted adolescents, parents who have children who were adopted as infants. Do you have a question?
Yeah, is this new survey going to be open-ended?
No, the new survey is going to be a version of the survey that'll go out. It has items on it like question items like, it's not open-ended. It has items like, I wish my adoptive parents were more open about my birth parents. I'm making that up. That's not one of them. I'm making that up. And then it would have ways in which they could agree or disagree or say how that statement applies to them.
Well, it's on a Likert scale?
Yep. It's going to be a scaled instrument, yes.
5-point scale.
Mm-hmm. 5-point scales. And we hope to pilot test that instrument, as I said, on 300 adoptive parents and youth. Now this gets back to this gentleman's question. Pardon me?
300,
That's a lot.
Please think of the response, how do you call it? That you lose response possibilities. You will lose the 300 for other studies.
Well, but he's saying you'll lose the 300 as people that you could. Well, what we're hoping is that our.
You don't need 300. You need 10 or 20.
Well, our study will be, and I'll get into this later, but our study will be conducted in 4 states: Colorado, Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And what we selected those 4 states because they have a good mix of rural and urban, and they have a fair number of transracial as well as international and minority adoptions. And what we'd like to do is field test people in states other than the agencies that were selected from those 4. So that would avoid the contamination. But we.
Too much. I mean, the basics. You will lose energy on your basic study. That's what I'm approaching you now as a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do so much just before you start the main study, you will have lost a lot of energy, a lot of money, and a lot of people and so on. So be a little bit careful.
I think the study is 4 years long, and I think that we've been fairly careful about budgeting how much needs to go into each phase. And the 300 responses, we want to subject those to some kind of factor analysis or some kind of statistical analysis to see which items should be dropped. So we want to do a pretty careful working through the instrument.
You are
taking a lot of other different
creating the
samples.
instrument.
Pardon me?
You have different samples, rural sample, you have urban sample, and you have.
You are making the instrument.
Therefore, you are, this,
It's not the pilot study.
It's still not the final study.
No, this is not the pilot study. You are making the instrument.
Yes,
So
yes.
It's not the pilot study.
No.
Therefore- No, carry on. Sorry.
It's all what's going into the creation of the instrument.
Yeah.
And
Different.
yes,
This may be a premature question, but.
But you're gonna
how
ask
about
it.
selecting your states?
how did we go about selecting our states?
Uh-huh.
We looked at the demographics in those states, and we wanted to know whether they would represent as much as possible, again, that mix of transracial, international, minority adoptees, as well as the rural-urban stuff. We had originally all 50 states in the sample. National Institute of Mental Health said, we want you to cut it down to 4. And they suggested that it be 4 contiguous states. So we had originally, instead of Colorado, we had Iowa. And Iowa, their records are in such horrible shape that they said they couldn't do it. And so then Colorado said that they would agree to do it. So we're hoping that the study will later be replicated nationally.
The reason I ask is because as a Colorado adoption professional, I can say that
Mhm.
the data you get from Colorado is going to be significantly different than the data you might get from California.
Well,
I was going to suggest that you keep track of who doesn't participate,
mm-hmm.
because I would suspect that if you ask families in California and Colorado, more would participate in California than Colorado.
But the other thing to remember is that these are agencies from those 4 states, and then they will be selecting families. Now, those families may have had 12 or 18 years to move to wherever. So
We move extremely slow in Colorado.
that may be true, but they may or may not. I mean, they may start in that state, but they may have moved, God knows where at this point.
Oh, in terms of, they may be living in some.
They may be living in any part of the country, but the agencies will be selected over there. I see a lot of vans in Colorado. People move in Colorado.
We still have a lot of don't tell folks in Colorado.
Yeah, we have a lot of those in Minnesota too. Anyway, but back to your question about where are your comments useful? If any of you, now this is again an invitation to help us, because if any of you have either adoptive parents who have kids that were adopted as infants, or have access to any adoptive adolescents that would like to help us field test our instruments, I would be really excited to get that information. And maybe now's a good time. If this won't be on the tape, but thanks, Jim. Yeah. The sheet that Jim is passing out is just a brief overview of the study in terms of the kind of the place that we are right now, as well as a postcard that if you have anybody that could help field test, we would certainly appreciate that help.
Do you want to exclude those 4 states?
Do we want to exclude those 4 states? We have talked about that and gone back and forth, and why don't you send us the information? And what we've said is if we are not able to somehow get them outside the 4 states, then maybe we'll have to go with that and then see what happens. But if you've got it, send it to us.
Just to reiterate, so I'm clear, you're interested in adoptive parents of adolescents now?
Yes, who were...
Not parents who've raised children and now they're older, or maybe, so, okay.
Adoptive parents who have an adolescent now, but that adolescent was adopted as an infant. Right. The dates, I should mention, there's a date on the bottom of that says the surveys will be ready by April 20th and return May 30th. Cross those dates out. Those are not the valid dates for now. And what we're talking about is something just that's going to happen before June. Something that's just going to happen before June. So if you have any way to give us access to field testing folks, that would be very, very helpful.
You want California?
Sure, that would be terrific. Yep. And again, this is where your comments on our instruments would be really helpful. We're hoping that these instruments will be a real contribution to the adoption research. You know, that they'll be used over and over again, and that's why I think we're being somewhat pedantic about how we develop them, and really quite careful. Anyway, we're also hoping that this study will be replicated nationally, you know, beyond what is being done right now. The second phase is the collection of the data, and let me talk briefly about that, although I've gotten into it just very, very quickly. We'll be collecting data from public and private agencies, which will be randomly sampled in the 4 states, and as also independent adoptions. Now, the independent adoptions, we're probably not going to get a random sample of those folks because it's difficult to randomly sample doctors, lawyers, or whoever was doing that. That we're hoping to get through what used to be called OURS, the organization, which is now called Adoptive Families of America, and that will be a volunteer sample. But the public and private agencies will be randomly selected. And we'll be getting data from adopted adolescents, non-adopted, and adoptive parents. And the numbers will come out like this. We'll be looking, and this again gets back to the question of a control group. We'll be looking at families without biological adolescents and with biological adolescents. So some of the families will have a built-in control group in that we'll be studying. Half the families will come from or half the sample will have biological siblings to compare themselves to. We also have another way of looking at control groups, which is sort of the data banks that we have at Search Institute. We have a 32-year history of doing research studies. And for example, we have just completed, well, I shouldn't say completed because we're still collecting data. We have in our data banks information about on self-esteem and some of those factors. 50,000 youth in various school districts throughout the country, and roughly 2% of those are adopted, and so we are able to compare, you know, our results to the adopted folks in that random sample, large sample throughout the country, as well as the non-adopted folks in that sample, which comprises a large number. Yes?
Yes, I noticed that a control group of adolescents that are not adopted is not up there. And did you purposely leave that out, or did you overlook it? Because the dynamics are going to be different between families who have blended families that are adopted and biological children. And
that's the data bank that I'm talking about. We're not taking a whole different sample, but many of the measures that we use many of the measures that we use in this study will be the same as those we've used in other studies. So we'll be able to compare our data to data that we've already collected in the last several years, and that will be our non-adoptive families control groups. So yeah, it's in there. It's not built into this particular study. And after the data is collected, phase 3 is analysis and dissemination of information, and that will take roughly about a year. The data itself will be collected early 1992, so about 9 months from now is when we begin the actual study. And the study, I think I said, is 4 years in length, and the last year of the study will be that business about what does this all mean? And that's the point at which all the people that have been involved in it up to now, and all of you in the audience are getting increasingly involved by your information and any help that you can give us. But we'll be going back to all those experts and whoever and saying, okay, these are the results. These are the printouts. This is what the data says. Now help us interpret them. You know, what does this mean? It's of no use for us to go to folks and say, these are the results and this is what they mean. Because again, many of you have far more expertise in adoption than we do. And again, that's where we hope you will then take the information and begin your influence of national policy, or changing the mental health profession, or changing your social service agencies, and doing whatever it is that you do in your sphere of influence and applying our results. And that's also the point at which we hope to give back some of what has been very generously given to us throughout the process, because this has been a real give and take kind of thing. And I think that's all I need to say about our study, but there's another question?
Yeah, I want
to your comment about what are adoptees telling us?
Well, let me amplify just a bit.
Okay, please do.
Initially, you said your expertise is in research,
Mhm.
and that's why you bring in coalitions.
Mhm.
I'm impressed with your research skills. I believe you're sincere in wanting to try and do the best possible thing you can do, and
Thank you.
your technology sounds fine. My concern
Mhm.
has to do with that population that you're serving, particularly the adoptees.
Mhm.
To have valid data, you need randomness.
Mhm.
And more important than that, you need honesty.
Mhm.
I think you're dealing with adoptees, you're dealing with a very peculiar population. I've had a number of experiences where, and go back to the adoptees in denial. Some adoptees will just, they'll tell you what's on their mind. They'll tell
And
you
many
all the
won't.
conflicts. Others, I've had a number of experiences in talking to individual adoptees where they just totally lock on searching for you.
And the same thing is true with parents.
So I don't push search. Well, adoption's wonderful. My adoptive parents were wonderful. And they get to run on. Well, I've seen it enough so that there's a way that you can cut into that, and then you start. You know what the issues are, so you start talking to them about the issues of well, geez, wouldn't it be kind of nice to see people who maybe look like you. Well, that's and then what I'm saying is it's not your vehicle, your research instrument. It's what they're going to give you back on it. And
How would you, we've discussed this so many times, we thought that the one group that we want to study the most and is going to be most difficult to study is the group that's in denial. Both the kids that may or may not be, as well as the parents that say, we don't want to be in your study because adoption is not an issue for us. How would you, and I welcome any suggestions on this, how would you crack that population? Because that's precisely the folks that we want.
I can sit down with somebody. I feel relatively confident in being able to crack it.
One-on-one.
One-on-one.
How would you do it in this kind of a
Research
format?
instrument, I think that's what really bothers me. It
Mhm.
scares me that I don't think you're going to be able to do it, and I can't tell you how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But you're gonna produce data that is going to have a certain credibility attached to it, and much of it may be the good adoptee who says yes, adoption's wonderful, and gosh, I feel so lucky. And it's the good adoptee acting out.
Sure.
One of the,
I'll
I'm
get
Jim
you.
Gamboni, and I work with Search 2, and I'm not an expert in adoption, but I deal with the programs and services end of the thing. And one of the things is, just as an outsider looking at it, and also somebody who has a doctorate who looks at it from a professional point of view, I was impressed with the honesty that came out of the open-ended questionnaires, and granted that they weren't random, granted that they were volunteer kinds of samples. There was a certain amount of, I know there's really some support at the Institute in terms of getting that kind of response, which is probably in some ways not even as good a scenario as what we're going to be doing in terms of going out and trying to contact with the agencies, contact with people. So, and I think that the second point is that the research results are only as good as the data that goes into them, and it gets to your point. I think that what it means is that on a research level, when those research results come out, the limitations of your research have to be stated as positively and as strongly as what the research that you feel is strong about that, and so I'm saying, what I'm saying is that.
But you understand, this is a political issue, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
It's a major political issue.
Mhm.
And people might be quite willing to, if we jump in there, first thing is we don't, there's a desire to be random,
Can
but
we
the control
invite
of
you for
randomness
dinner
is
tonight
in the
to
hands
stay
of
with
adoptive
Paul
parents.
and me, and I'd
So
like to
that's the
discuss
first
a
thing
little
that
bit
skews
more
your results.
about your
All I would
study,
say is that
because I have just finished the study on adolescents, and I am doing a second one now, so you can perhaps, how far is,
Are you going to the banquet?
yeah, of course, how far is Minneapolis from Buffalo?
With the job of this research institute is from a political point of view, and understanding that we're involved in a political process,
It's
is that we have to be
two-day
extremely
drive,
careful
maybe
in what
about
is done, and to take the utmost
2
care
hours.
of
15,
gathering
16
the
drive.
information.
No, 15,
And then
16
as a
hour drive.
research organization,
No,
we have
but
to
we
do
did
the
by plane.
Oh, by plane.
itself
2 hours.
in terms of
Yeah,
dealing with
2
issues
hours.
around adolescents and families and teen
And from
pregnancy and
Albany,
other
from
issues
Albany.
we dealt with.
Is it
to be
near?
very, very
Is
specific
Albany near? I think
about
Albany
what the
is more
research says
east.
and what it doesn't say.
That is far.
That's the best
A
that
little
we can
farther.
do. And
Well, I was
it's up to
thinking
you
of
to take
seeing
that
you.
and
I
do
was
what
thinking
you
of
need to
seeing
do
you.
with that information.
And you are
You can
very
criticize
much
the
interested in
information,
it,
you
and
can support the
perhaps I can
information,
Let's
give
sit
some
and you can
together at the
suggestions.
banquet
criticize the way
tonight.
it's been
Let's
conducted
do
and
that.
how it's been done. But our job as a research organization, I mean, in order for this research to be somewhat valuable, if it is going to be valuable, is to maintain a position of credibility ourselves in a position to be valuable.
You understand I have not been attacking you.
I understand. I'm just trying to say what our position
I understand
is.
your research problems in this, and I just want to convey clearly my concern
Mhm.
that you've got a peculiar population, and you need randomness, you need honesty. You already don't have randomness. And honesty may also be in jeopardy in some cases. I'm not saying 100%, because you've got a range there. So you've got honesty in there. I have to presume there is on your initial instrument. But then you're going to get down to X percentages say and X percentages say, and that's where you may get into extra trouble.
But they have to like quantify the
Okay,
results. You're
make one
asking for a
quick
qualitative study.
We have a lot of comments that people want to make. I want to make sure we get
Just
them
one
all.
quick comment.
What's it,
I appreciate the concern the gentleman is raising.
Perception
I think
is-
a lot of these things, excuse me, I'm trying to address your concern, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sympathetic to that concern. I think a lot of things could be tested in their pre-testing. We will do that with instrument. And they can see that if this population is, that you can get some variance in the response on your pre-testing. If you are correct, as you say, then the
I don't
response
know
may
that
not be
I'm
very.
not stating a position of fact. I'm stating perception based on experience. So
But that's what the researcher is going to test the perception of the reality. And the perception is very well taken. They have to take, a researcher proceeds from perception or some idea out there, and that's what they're going to do, the test out those perceptions.
I think I understand.
So it may be true, it may not be true, but that's what I think they will validate the fact whether this group is articulate. If it's articulate, to what extent do they really give a valid, reliable information?
How are you
If
gonna
the
do that?
information does produce some variance in the response, this kind of thing, and if it doesn't, then perhaps then they probably have to modify some method of data collection, information gathering, maybe a combination of certain few other things, interview plus something. I think that's what the job of the pre-testing is.
You do that with the validity and reliability of testing your instrument to make sure that your instrument is getting the kind of information
Well,
you're going after.
that's where I've got the concern. How are you gonna know you got valid data? Because you've got to understand, you've got a peculiar population.
Yeah, but
This
supposing
is not,
that-
this is not a situation where you just go out and you've got a normal population. You can assume honesty, and then within that, you're gonna get a slight range of variation on how truthful people are. What I'm saying is I think you've got a very peculiar population and a strong bias towards wanting to be, for a number of people wanting to be that good adoptee and tell you what they think you want to hear, not what's really in their head.
And I don't want to leave you yet. I think a lot of people want to
Yeah.
respond,
Oh,
so
sure.
I want to make sure we get different folks. And this lady in the back and then this lady over here.
I find myself sitting here with really mixed emotions about this because I understand very clearly what you're saying, that the results could affect public policy. And yet, what you're going to do is get the results of this particular population as honestly as they can give it at the place that they are now. And that is valid for where they are right now. It does not say a thing about where they're going to be 10 years from now. And the fear is that we're going to have public policy based on adolescent thinking and adolescent perceptions. That's what scares me. It's a dilemma. I don't know the answer out of it.
I'll get to you in a second.
I'm wondering how the ethnic homogeneity of Wisconsin and Minnesota might affect this, the attitudes and the responses in this study.
You add into the cultural diversity of Colorado and Chicago and Illinois, and you're dealing with a variety of ethnic diversity.
Colorado has diversity?
Well, I don't think, but you've got half of the states, you see. You've got Minnesota and Wisconsin versus, I mean.
Actually, Minnesota ranks third in the country in the number of transracial adoptions. Right. Are you worried? So I'm not worried that the adoptees will be misrepresented.
Well, I'm just asking if the preponderance of Scandinavian residents in those two states would somehow or another affect attitudes about this issue.
Well,
I don't know.
We have a strong white, nevertheless, no doubt, we have a strong white population in terms of adoptive parents in those two states.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, because Cook County, where Chicago is such a large part of Illinois, they will account for almost half of the Illinois sample, we're suspecting. That is a large black population that will be represented there in adoptive parents and youth. So we're hoping that we'll get enough mix of all of them.
Is it, your concern is that if there will be, I think you're doing in sampling, would be quota sampling, I believe, that's what you will do?
Stratified
You will not,
sampling of
you will not
agencies.
mix that, because they all have different dynamics, which is trying to study. So if they do quota sampling, then I think they will separate out and make them compatible within those different groups. Scandinavian, international adoption, within international, is there any difference, Scandinavian or Asian?
It's like just as a side note, it's a perception that Minnesota is and Wisconsin are primarily Scandinavian. Actually, the largest ethnic population in both of the states is German as opposed to Scandinavian. This is a perception that people have in the states. I like to correct that whenever I can.
I think a positive way to deal with the lack of complete randomness is to decide to do some analysis of the non-participants, so that even if you find families where they are not willing to allow the adolescent child to participate, perhaps either the parents or the agency can supply data about the one issue of which I teach in prisons, and I see an overrepresentation of adoptees both in prisons and in group homes. And so one question I would want addressed in terms of the non-participants is, are there children in institutions or criminal justice system already? Because there's going to be a skew, and those folks may not be real cooperative in dealing with agencies because they're angry.
Right. And yes, maybe the situations in which they say, well, we know about the adoption, we don't want our kid to know about it. Maybe they would be willing to fill out the survey. Absolutely, we don't want to ignore that data.
So the non-participants may have more valuable data for you than the participants.
They always have very valuable data. I'll get her.
Well, I think it's also true that as an adoptive parent, the teen has had loads and loads of problems. Sometimes, I flip-flop on that. Sometimes I want to put all calls on adoption because then I don't have any responsibility for it. On the other hand, of course, I realize that I have all too, and the balance of where it's at. But I have a kid who now has all kinds of diagnoses. If I want to get out of the psychoval that the school gave after they kicked her out, not while she was still there, but once they got rid of her at 16, I finally talked him into a psychoval. And I didn't have insurance, so I couldn't pay for any help for her, and there was no subsidy in those days. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to see the results of anything that would help, and she would too. She knows she's hurting, she knows something's wrong, she doesn't know why. We've gone to counseling for years, no help, don't do any good. So, yeah, well, I have no problem being honest about it. What have I got to lose? I've got a kid who can't function, she's almost 19. And she can't live on her own, and she can't stay home. She's not sick enough to be placed anywhere, she's not well enough to live on her own. She knows she's not normal. She's not ready to come here and talk. Every year I come, I invite her, she's not ready.
You were going to make
Yeah, the thing is that I just wonder why you approach only the person by mail. I was thinking of how you approach the adolescents. And we just finished the study, and we know now how difficult it is. And we had a lot of non-respondents. It was very difficult to approach. And we did interview them. And perhaps one part is that you send a mail questionnaire with the simple questions. and that you use the more deep-going instruments for also a random sample, but that you interview, and then you might prevent what he is saying, that you get the problem cases. Because some of these problem cases, these problem persons, like to talk about their life, but that will cost a lot of time to approach them. Don't think that just one telephone call or one letter is enough. No, definitely not. And because they are very much hesitating about talking about life. One way they like to talk about it, and the other way they want to say I'm normal and I'm not adopted and these are my parents and get out of my way. But there are two persons in that, not all of them, but quite a few of them. So I would suggest you to interview a smaller part and to send a mail questionnaire with the simple questions to a bigger part. That is how I would do it.
Or even interview those after the mail question. I say, or interview after the mail question to get some.
That's what I'm saying. Of course, you send the mail question and then interview. But they are doing it, I don't know.
What's your experience with the adolescent population before you have studied adolescents?
Adolescents for 30 years. What has been our experience with
What's
them?
your experience? Are the concerns?
Generally, the experience has been if you pay an adolescent.
Yeah.
So we're giving them each somewhere between $10
You
and
have to.
$20.
You have to.
You know, then they'll do it. $10 for a kid for an hour, $20 for an hour, gets them to answer the questions.
That's what we do.
And as long as they're guaranteed,
You have to.
we have quite safeguarded their anonymity and confidentiality in terms of a consent form goes to the parents. The parents will never, we never get access to their names. I mean, that's all done through the agency, but questionnaire goes to the parents, then they fill out the questionnaire and send us their consent form back. Then we send, then the questionnaire is sent to the kid, and then the kid sends that back, and when that gets in, then the agency sends them their $10.
The agency sends the questionnaire directly to the kid?
What's a safeguard to keep the parent from looking over their shoulder?
No, seriously, I agree with you. I agree with you.
It goes to the kid, and then we don't have a safeguard.
Will you put a large disclaimer that you don't have that safeguard?
What would happen if the kid came into the agency?
What would happen if the kid came into the agency?
Then you
It's
couldn't
an
have
answer
any
there.
of those.
Well, the
kids.
kids are all over though, geographically.
Then if they moved, you couldn't have them.
What? If they moved, you couldn't, you wouldn't have no, if that was a prerequisite, then you lose your randomness.
Well, all right. Okay.
The other
Is there
thing
some
we
other
could do is,
place that the child, that they could go?
Local Department of Social Services.
Well, that's maybe not neutral, but is there some other neutral place that they could go?
You mean to get the questionnaire?
No, to answer the questionnaire.
To answer the question.
Or get it, and get it.
I see what you're saying.
Because you immediately leave yourself open to the controlling adoptive parent.
School?
Or may or may not.
The Delaware study, that's.
Not that there are any.
Or not one.
I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure that it's 20 after 5, and I want to make sure that those of you that need to leave can do so. At the same time, I don't want to cut those of you off that still would like to stay and comment about it.
May I say something? Not a final thing, but because you have the final question, but may I say something? This is a very interesting study.
Okay, go ahead.
May I say something? It's a very interesting study. I think it is a very professional group of people who are doing it, not on the adoption side, but on the other side. The thing is that we should try to help them as much as possible. This is our criticism beforehand. But also, when we know a lot more, some of you know a lot more, please contact them and have direct influence. I think that I would suggest you, because what you say is correct. There will be a lot of influence after this study. And they are very open, so I feel that everything is okay, and we will never tell the whole truth, because, it is human beings. They are sometimes lying, sometimes too honest or whatever. But they don't have a lot of influence, so we
Please,
should
we
help
are
them.
open.
We should help them.
What you have to say, so thank you. I always learn more than I impart in things like this.
You pay me afterwards, okay?
You know, he gets $20.
He gets
Adults get $20.
I did too. You're a wonderful group. And I know that many many of you still had your hands raised, so please, if you need to go, I would understand if you have something that you still want to tell me. We'll see you at the banquet. Yep.
Just want to comment real quick, I was very impressed with your professionalism, because I've been to a lot of different workshops, and not to putting people down, but this is great because it's stuff that you can see, you can talk about, and it's just real professional, and I really appreciate it, especially considering that this was the last workshop of the whole session, because I went to one, and the information was great, but she read the whole thing.
This concludes this session.